Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm very pleased today to stand in this House and talk about sustainable development and Canada's environment, and to point out the vast swath of hypocrisy that this government has undertaken in its time in office. That regardless of political stripe, regardless where somebody is at in terms of environmental policy in this country, everybody agree that the Liberals in this Parliament have a woeful and inept track record of doing anything for Canada's environment. So let's start with the carbon tax. So we just had a member, a colleague across the way, stand up from the Liberal caucus and say the following: a carbon tax should be higher. We actually had a Liberal stand up. I cannot wait to show Canadians this, stand up and say that the carbon tax should be higher. And she said that in response to a question that I asked her about whether or not their carbon tax would actually do anything to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Now, why did she try to spin out of that question or show their true agenda? It's because we know that the carbon tax that Justin Trudeau has put in place on Canadians will do nothing.
I just want to remind the member she's not to mention individuals' names that are sitting in the House during her speech. So resuming debate.
My apologies, Madam Speaker. It's the new environment. You know, one gets very excited about a carbon tax and fighting it and fighting the perpetrator of the carbon tax. You know, I hope Canadians will forgive me for that slip of the tongue. But we know that this carbon tax that has been imposed by this disastrous Liberal Prime Minister, Canadians are having to pay for his mistake of putting in place a carbon tax and not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So let me explain this to you, Madam Speaker. If somebody in Canada wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they have to first realize that Canada is a place where we have an agricultural-based economy, we have a natural resource-based economy, we have a manufacturing-based economy, and all of those things are what? Carbon intensive. They take energy to run. It's cold here. I mean, just today, stepping outside of the House of Commons, a few short steps outside, you'll realize the fact that Canada needs energy to heat our buildings in the middle of January. And also, the reality is that many Canadians have to drive to work. We don't have the same sort of public transit infrastructure that a small European country would have. So when you put all of those things together and you look at the economic context of Canada, you understand that putting a price on carbon, that the price that the Prime Minister has put in place, will do nothing to change the demand for carbon. So somebody who is driving in to downtown Calgary from my riding of Calgary Nose Hill to work after the disastrous failure to build the Green Line in my riding, which my government, the former government, committed to, that they would actually have to do what? Fill their car up. They don't really have a choice on how they commute to work. So it doesn't matter what that price of gas is, they still have to put gas in their car. So if it is more expensive, that just means that there's more money coming out of their pocket. The only way that they're going to change their behavior is by saying, it is no longer affordable for me to drive to work. And in that case, we're actually seeing an economic reduction and contraction instead of doing what this government has, purported to do. They always stand up and talk about this, growing Canada's economy and balancing the environment. It was under our former Conservative government that for the first time in Canadian history, we saw a decoupling of economic growth. We saw the economy grow and expand, and the growth of greenhouse gas emissions drop. And why is that? Because we took an approach that we went to each of the major emitting sectors in Canada, and we said that we will put in place regulations such that they actually have to adapt to a lower carbon emitting standard over time. And that actually saw a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Passenger vehicles, the coal-fired electricity sector, all regulations put in place under a Conservative government. But carbon tax It's just a consumption tax. It's like they've added another GST to Canada's economy. It's not going to do anything to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, it's so devastating, as somebody who cares about this issue, to watch their uninformed environment minister stand up and be completely unaware about any of the realities of the failed economic model of this situation. Now, of course, my colleague opposite that just stood up and made a speech, she got to their hidden agenda. It's not high enough. We need to make it higher. Because anybody who watches the Liberal government, they know that they can't resist doing what, Madam Speaker? Raising a tax. So if anybody thinks that the carbon tax is bad now, it's going to do what? It's going to go up. And this government has no plan on how to grow the economy. All they have a plan to do is pay a deficit or to build a deficit. And what does that mean? Today's deficit are tomorrow's taxes, Madam Speaker. So you've got this carbon tax that's not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You've got these huge growing deficits. And you know what, Madam Speaker? For the amount of money that this government has spent on nothing that has materially impacted the lives of Canadians in a positive way, frankly, we could have had a gold-plated rocket ship to the moon. Canadians don't see anything for these deficits, but they will see increased taxes. And Canadians are tired of paying for Justin Trudeau, my apologies, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister's ego, his love for himself, and his failed policies. And that's why we can't trust them on any sort of policy related to sustainable development. But I want to build on that case. We know the carbon tax is a failure, but there's something even bigger in terms of hypocrisy. So this government, Madam Speaker, has done everything possible to undermine the workers in the energy sector, the industries that are part of the energy sector across this country. They've done everything possible to call their jobs dirty. The Prime Minister even went abroad to Paris, and he said, I wish we could phase out the energy sector faster. And none of the people on this side of the aisle support transporting Canada's energy products in the most environmentally responsible way, which is what? Pipelines. The people across the aisle, Madam Speaker, are content to let our energy products be transported in rail, which has both environmental implications as well as implications on our agriculture sector. So they're saying, let's do rail, let's not do pipelines, or let's shut the energy sector down. But at the same time, what are they doing? Let's talk about a pipeline, Madam Speaker, one of the few pipelines that the Liberal Party loves, and that's a pipeline of fecal matter. That's right. The same Liberal government that stand up and say they don't like pipelines get behind the former mayor of Quebec and approve the City of Montreal dumping billions of liters of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence River. And you have to, Madam Speaker, you have to appreciate people who are in the energy sector who get told on a daily basis that their jobs are dirty and that pipelines aren't environmentally sustainable. You have to appreciate the level of frustration and anger at the hypocrisy of this environment minister telling them that their jobs are dirty and working against pipelines. I believe her chief of staff actually made an entire career out of fighting pipelines. No pipelines for the energy sector. But what did they do in their first months in office? On her 6th day in office, day 6, top priority, turn the lights on in the office. The environment minister approved a plan from the City of Montreal to dump billions of liters of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence River. So they're concerned about pipelines in Quebec, but not about fecal matter pipelines. Fecal matter pipelines, okay. Job-creating energy pipelines, not okay. That is sustainable development under the Liberal government. Now it gets worse. The Conservative government had actually put Montreal's plan to dump pipeline of, I'm not sure if I'm going to get called, I'm not sure what word I can use for fecal matter in this House that's parliamentary, but viewers at home can imagine and insert the word appropriately here, but the Conservative government actually said maybe we shouldn't be developing a pipeline of fecal matter since there were a lot of concerns about fish habitat and the terrible precedent that this decision would create for the future. We wanted to ensure that all of the appropriate actions and research had been done, and we actually named a panel to review the plan. And in October of 2015, our former government mandated this independent science review panel to review the proposed discharge of raw sewage of Montreal. This was a very important step. But what did the sustainable development-loving environment minister, Alberta has to have dirty jobs environment minister, no energy pipeline environment minister do on her 6th day in office? Said, nope, no Alberta pipelines, but Montreal, dump away. Dump all of that fecal matter into the river. We don't need a fish habitat. Dump it in. Set that precedent. That's great. That's sustainable development under the Liberal government. So we have a carbon tax that won't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have the Minister of the Environment jetting around the world to climate action panels and cocktail receptions, fully understanding that this government is never going to meet their own self-imposed greenhouse gas emissions target, while at the same time calling the people in my riding their jobs dirty, telling the rest of Canada that we can't put in place energy infrastructure that is one of the most sustainable ways to transport energy products around the world, and signing off on a plan that had no review to just dump billions of liters of fecal matter into the St. Lawrence River. Baby beluga, I wonder how he felt about that. Come on. Like, this is the sort of stuff, this is why this government has no credibility whatsoever on sustainable development. Whenever I see this government stand up and talk about the environment, I mean, it's one of the areas where the New Democratic Party and the Conservative Party can actually unite. We can actually say, no credibility there. Nope. But it's even worse, Madam Speaker, because rather than talking about policy, they just stand up and frankly just repeat falsehoods to Canadians. They're trying to buy the votes of Canadians with their mumbo-jumbo, while at the same time building pipelines of billions of liters of raw sewage. Think about that. Think about, I want people to visualize this. Visualize a full porta potty, okay, after the end of a summer fair. Okay, now multiply that by 1 billion and dump that into the St. Lawrence River. Think about that for a second, okay? That's what we're talking about. That is what this environment minister did on her 6th day in office. Yet, the jobs of the people in my riding are dirty, and that we should phase out the energy sector. So, you know, pardon me, Madam Speaker, if I have some level of skepticism on this government's sustainable development plan. You know, I have watched this. I thought, you know what, they can't possibly go into the lead up into a federal election and not deal with the Montreal raw sewage issue. They can't possibly stand by this. But yet they are. That's their sustainable development priority, which I'm so proud that the leader of my party stood up and said, Conservative government would not allow this. This is not something that we think is sustainable development. You know, I look at some of the things that this government could have done over the last several years. In 2017, 250 billion liters of raw sewage were spilled or leaked into our waterways without being treated. This is the equivalent of 86,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Again, try and visualize that in terms of volume of porta potty, Madam Speaker. Pipelines with energy projects, not okay. They'd rather that not happen. No pipelines that are subject to the most rigorous environmental assessments in the world. Nope, can't do that. 86,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of fecal matter, good to go. That's the Liberal Party's sustainable development agenda. And in 2016, under this government's watch, only 159 out of 269 municipalities reported their sewage leaks. Why is the Liberal government not concerned with these missing reports, or why is this government not helping these municipalities to upgrade their sewage infrastructure to ensure that no raw sewage is spilled into Canadian waters? Now, I remember the previous Conservative government, and on this issue, I'm pleased to say that the former Conservative government set the stage in 2012 with the first wastewater regulations as a means of cleaning up 150 billion litres of untreated or undertreated wastewater or sewage, which is dumped into waterways each year. Again, where is the Liberals' action on the environment? Making Canadians pay for this Prime Minister's mistake, his failed legacy of any sort of environmental standard whatsoever, at the pump or on their tax bills. You know, a lot of Canadians are waking up to the hypocrisy of this government across a majority of issues. It's very exciting to see. You know, I was able to travel across British Columbia this month, and I traveled into some ridings, for example, Cloverdale-Langley. And we had a town hall of about 250 people showed up, and I thought, you know what, this is going to be an interesting room. There was a Liberal member of Parliament here that was run by a considerable majority, and I had people stand up in that room and say this: I voted for the Prime Minister, and he betrayed me. This is why the Conservative Party is rolling out a plan of pragmatism. It's why we've opposed government bills like Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, which do nothing to practically clean up the Canadian environment, but do everything to make it harder for Canadians to work on a daily basis. And that's where you have to, Madam Speaker, wonder what this government is managing to. If they're managing to taxing Canadians more but getting less results, what's in it for Canadians? Why do they have to pay for this Prime Minister's mistake? And it's because every person across the aisle here, every person who votes in favor of these bills that do nothing to help the Canadian environment or the economy, but actually make lives worse for Canadians, what is their motive on that? Why are they doing this? Well, they could just be doing this, you know, because they haven't actually reviewed this legislation and they're not doing their jobs. That could be one particular matter. But when I watch the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister, and when I watch what their priorities are, you know, going to these TEDx conferences and these, you know, different conferences around the world where they're just spouting their talking points to an international audience, as opposed to looking at home and doing their job here and then reporting back to the world on success, you know, I kind of wonder if it's more about their ego and seeking power for power's sake as opposed to doing something that actually matters. And you don't have to take my word for it, Madam Speaker, although I would like it if you did. The reality is that the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development actually talked about some of these issues in his report this year. It's important to highlight this because it talks about the fact that the measures to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions contained in this government's framework had yet to be implemented. And that's on top of this carbon tax that this government has put forward, which is going to do nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it is going to make Canadians pay for this Prime Minister's mistakes. This report is actually quite shocking for a government that had an Environment Minister dress up as a climate crusader for Halloween and put it on Twitter. You'd think a climate crusader could get a better report from the Environment and Sustainable Development Commissioner than this. But I want to close with this, Madam Speaker. This government can stand up, they can obfuscate, they can put all of these pretty talking points forward, but at the end of the day, their priority and their track record in this government has been a carbon tax that makes life more expensive for Canadians, does nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, has stymied infrastructure, energy infrastructure in this country, and they've prioritized billions of litres of fecal matter going to the St. Lawrence River. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you kindly, Madam Speaker. To begin, I question the relevance of the member's entire submission on this point, given that we're debating the Senate amendments to Bill C-57, which she didn't touch on. In any event, she spent a good portion of her time on wastewater. I'd just like to point out some of the inaccuracies throughout the speech. She indicated they took a regulatory approach. What they didn't have was an infrastructure plan to actually allow municipalities to deal with the wastewater problems that we're actually doing right now. Second, she suggested that this whole side of the House is somehow opposed to the energy industry. Nothing could be further from the truth. I personally spent about 5 years working in the city of Calgary, the same city that the member represents, and I can tell you that this side of the House does have supporters of the sector who are working hard to ensure that we develop our resources in a responsible way. Now, when it comes to our plan to put a price on pollution, we have to start by saying climate change is a problem. They've yet to pitch a single idea on what they're actually going to do to address the threat posed by climate change. We don't think pollution should be free, personally on this side of the House. We've actually sought the advice of the world's leading climate economists. They all come back to the same point that the most effective thing you can do to combat climate change is to put a price on pollution and return revenues to citizens. That is what we're doing. So my question to the member opposite is, why is she and the Leader of the Opposition committed to taking Doug Ford's approach to climate change and taking money from their constituents to make pollution free again?
The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
My colleague mentioned relevancy, Madam Speaker. I think it's fairly relevant to talk about billions of litres of fecal matter being poured into the St. Lawrence River under the watch of this Environment Minister as relevant to the sustainable development of Canada. He talks about infrastructure. The only infrastructure dollars that have been prioritized by this government is the Infrastructure Minister's office renovations at the front of this Parliament. Canadians have seen virtually no movement of the billions of dollars of deficit on infrastructure across this country. And for a man to say that he worked in Calgary's energy sector and then vote time and time again on bills to support the Trans Mountain Pipeline or to get energy workers back to work, we have one word for that in Calgary, and that's traitor.
I would just ask the honourable member to ensure that she watches the words that she uses in the House of Commons, and I just want to remind that there are words that shouldn't be used in the House of Commons, and we need to be respectful of other members. We may not be in agreement as to what they're saying or what their positions are, but we should be respectful of the words that we should be very careful on the words that are being used. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And, I think we're starting to see where the Conservatives are going to be posturing themselves with rhetoric as we head into the next election. And fair enough. They have a good reputation of talking about things that are full of fecal matter. So therefore, I think that this is right up their alley. But my question to the member is specifically, she referenced 6 days after this government came into power and what the Environment Minister was forced to do. Why was the Environment Minister forced to do that? Because the preceding 10 years, there was absolutely no work done from the previous Conservative government with respect to building up the infrastructure so that the City of Montreal didn't have to do what they had to do. It's quite simple, Madam Speaker. It's literally a pool. It's literally a pool of water and a pool of fecal matter, and it's a matter of whether or not we can properly process what is in there before it enters into the St. Lawrence. If the proper infrastructure had been in place, the Environment Minister would not have had to do that 6 days after we came into government.
The honourable member for Prince Albert is very capable of answering the questions. I would ask all other members to hold up on their thoughts. The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Well, once again, I'll point out the fact that this government has racked up so much deficit, increased Canadians' taxes, and has done nothing for infrastructure in Canada. Under our former Conservative government, Canada's age of infrastructure reduced significantly, and we had huge investments in infrastructure under what? A balanced budget and the lowest federal tax burden in over 50 years, a concept this government has no idea whatsoever. And this member can stand up and be glib about this, but the reality is like he's actually making excuses for Montreal dumping billions of litres of sewage into the St. Lawrence River. If this government was so, and now he's saying, Madam Speaker, they didn't have a choice. If they actually cared about infrastructure, why did they approve this plan? I'm not sure any scientist would actually say that this is a great thing. And where was their infrastructure support? That's the problem, Madam Speaker. This government has had 3 years to do anything on any of these files, and they've done nothing except spend money and raise taxes. And now they have to account because Canadians are tired for paying for this Prime Minister's mistakes and failed policies.
And I just want to remind members again that when somebody has the floor, to be respectful. The Honourable Member Kingston and the Islands had the opportunity to ask his question, and I would just ask him to allow the person that has the floor to have the opportunity to respond without being interrupted. The questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And it's great to see you again in the chair. A question I have to the Honourable Member, fellow member from Alberta. When the Conservatives were in power, much to their credit, they brought back in the Eco-Energy Retrofit Program, which is a great program which actually gives money to families or small businesses so that they can retrofit their buildings so that they can save in their energy bills. And in fact, when I was in the Public Works Committee, I actually brought forward the idea, why don't we take a look at how much taxpayer money could be saved if the federal government invested majorly in energy efficiency? And in the end, we had a fabulous report, and by the way, from a majority Conservative committee. So my question, Madam Speaker, through you to the member, the Conservatives brought in this plan. It was oversubscribed, people loved it, and they killed it. Why did they kill it? Because they wanted to bring down their deficit before the election. So does the member not believe that a good initiative for sustainable development is support Canadian families so they can do their part too and reduce their energy costs through a home energy retrofit program?
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Madam Speaker, one of the primary responsibilities we have in this place is to be wise stewards of taxpayer dollars. And unfortunately, that's a principle that's sometimes lost on parties that are to the left of the Conservative Party of Canada. And we actually should be looking at ways to, when we are in a deficit situation, return the budget back to balance. And that's something that this government has no intention of doing. That's quite clear at this point in time. I think that when you look at the record, the words that I twigged into with my colleague's question were doing things to help Canadian families make ends meet. I look at some of the things that none of the parties in this place support, common sense tax initiatives like income splitting that allowed people to value labor, to value the labor of people that might have lower income in a relationship. You know, I just think about all of those measures that many Canadians use to get by that were cancelled, that aren't supported by any other party in this place. And I look at the fact that nobody, I will give her party credit. I do think that her former leader probably would have governed to the right of this Prime Minister, but that said, nobody here ever talks about balanced budgets or deficit. And to me, that's walking away from the principle that we have on managing taxpayer dollars efficiently and effectively. Sometimes we have to talk about the fact that we have to live within our means, even here in government. And I'm very proud to say that our government left Canadians with a balanced budget, the lowest federal tax burden in over 50 years, and that's a good thing.
Questions et commentaires? Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent has a quick question. Madam Speaker, we often hear people say that the best way to reduce greenhouse gases is to impose a price on pollution. That's what I call the liberal tax. The problem is, Madam Speaker, for 2 years in Quebec, we did a study on the cap and trade. And the result was that there was no reduction in greenhouse gases. So I'd like to hear what the member has to say about the fact that the Liberals want to tax people, even though we're not sure of the results of this program based on the Quebec experience.
Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
The reality is that carbon in Canada is a good that is relatively inelastic. There aren't a lot of substitute goods for it, and therefore when you increase the price of carbon, you're not going to see a lot of behavior change, but you are going to see a restriction or a constriction on economic growth, as well as Canadians' ability to make ends meet. So that's why this will not work. The $40 price on carbon, although one of my colleagues from Quebec boldly said that they really want to increase this tax, they haven't been able to show at what price behavior would change in Canada, and they haven't been able to show that how at this carbon tax that they've introduced, at what point that would actually meet their emissions targets. That's why the carbon tax is such a fallacy, and it's something that the Liberal government should be walking away from.
Hear, hear.
Reprise